The Genovese Crime Family, the Ivy League of the Mafia, the most disciplined, the most feared, and the most powerful of all five families. For nearly a century, the Genovese have outlasted, outmaneuvered, and outsmarted law enforcement, rival families, and even their own internal threats. But who was the greatest boss? Was it Lucky Luciano, the architect of the modern mafia, or Frank Costello, the smooth-talking prime minister who controlled politicians like puppets? Maybe it was Vito Genovese, the power-hungry tycoon who would stop at nothing for absolute control. Or perhaps Gigante, the oddfather, who played crazy while secretly running the most powerful family of crime in America. These men built empires, they made billions, and they left behind a legacy of power, fear, and betrayal. Today, we're ranking every official boss of the Genovese family, from the untouchable masterminds to the ones who just kept the seat warm. Each boss will be judged on 6 key categories. Those are leadership, administration, economics, influence, discipline, and legacy. With a maximum score of 30 points, only the greatest will land in the S tier, which is the true Genovese legends, others not so much. Let's break it down. Who was the best boss? Who was the worst? And who truly earned their place in Mafia history? Lucky Luciano, the architect of the modern Mafia. Before Luciano, the Mafia was chaos, bosses fighting each other, backstabbing, and no real organization. But when he came to power, he changed the game forever. No one in American Mafia histories had more impact than Lucky Luciano. Without him, there's no commission, no five families, and no modern Cosa Nostra. As far as the leadership goes, Luciano was more than just a boss. He was what I'd call a kingmaker. He understood that violence alone wouldn't win power. You needed structure, discipline, and alliances. And in 1931, he proved it. Luciano orchestrated, the murders of the old school bosses Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, clearing the way for a new mafia order. So instead of a single boss of bosses, he created the commission, making sure that no one man had absolute power. And this move prevented endless mafia wars and kept the underworld stable for decades. And that alone makes him a legendary leader, and I give him a 5 out of 5. Administration, Luciano wasn't just a gangster. I felt that he was a visionary. He surrounded himself with some of the greatest mafia minds ever. He even had people that weren't officially made members like Meyer Lansky. He was the financial genius. He had Frank Costello, who was a underboss for him, the political mastermind. Another underboss, Vito Genovese, who was his ruthless enforcer. So they weren't just a crew, it was a government of crime, and Luciano made sure it was ran like a Fortune 500 company. And again, I have to give him a 5 out of 5 for administration. And then as far as economics, the money goes, under the Luciano, the Mafia didn't just survive, it became a multi-billion-dollar empire. And it was important because during Prohibition, he had dominated the bootlegging industry. He worked with the Irish, Jewish, and Italian gangs to build a network that stretched from New York to Chicago to Miami. But what made Luciano different was he planned for the future. So instead of dying when booze became legal, he shifted the Mafia into gambling, narcotics, labor unions, and racketeering. And the Mafia expanded globally, Cuba, the Caribbean, even Vegas. And it was all because of Luciano's vision. So again, I'd have to put him a 5 out of 5 on that. And then influence. Luciano didn't just control the Mafia. He controlled politicians, police, and even the U.S. military, if you want to believe that. During World War II, the U.S. Navy made a secret deal with Luciano, and he helped protect New York docks from the Nazi spies. And in return, he got a reduced prison sentence. And even behind bars, Luciano was running the underworld, and that's just how powerful he was. So, again, a 5 out of 5. Discipline, before Luciano, Mafia was a mess, bosses killing each other over petty fights, but under his rule, I would say the five families ran like a machine. So No unnecessary killings, no reckless wars. It was just business, and Luciano made sure that every hit was strategic, every deal was probable, and that every soldier followed the rules. So, again, 5 out of 5. And then the legacy. No single boss in Mafia history's had a bigger legacy than Luciano. Every Mafia rule still followed today, Luciano invented it. The way families are structured, Luciano designed it. The balance of power between crime families, Luciano made it possible. So even when he was deported to Italy in 1946, his influence might have faded a little bit, but it never went away. And until the day he died in 1962, Luciano was what I would call the American Mafia's true godfather. Again, 5 out of 5. So I would give him a perfect score of 30. No one shaped the Mafia more than Lucky Luciano. Every boss who came after him followed his blueprint, and without him, the Mafia as we know wouldn't have existed. And that's why Lucky Luciano stands alone at the top. So definitely in the S tier. Frank Costello, we call him the prime minister of the underworld. So understand the Mafia is built on two things, power and money, and to me, no one balanced that better than Frank Costello. And unlike other bosses, he didn't rule with violence. He led with influence. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a politician in the shadows. Judges, mayors, and even governors, they all answered to Costello. So with leadership, you see it, Frank Costello wasn't your typical Mafia boss. He didn't carry out hits. He didn't act like a thug, and he didn't start pointless wars. Instead, he ran the Mafia like a corporation. He took over as a Genovese boss after Lucky Luciano was deported back in 1946. Instead of fighting to control the streets, he focused on controlling the people who ran them. And if you were a mayor, a judge, or a governor in New York during the 40s and 50s, you didn't make a move without Frank Costello's blessings. And so I would put him at a 4 out of 5. I mean, he was a great leader, obviously. And, he kind of, as boss, is kind of a shorter reign, but, he didn't do quite as much as Lucky Luciano, but he kind of carried the torch forward. And administration, we go to Costello. He knew how to surround himself with the right people. He wasn't a dictator. He was more of a strong executive that built like this strong executive, like Fortune 500 leadership team. His underboss, Willie Moretti, handled the muscle. He had Meyer Lansky around to help handle the money, and Costello himself handled politicians. And, this was Mafia power at its highest level. It was pretty amazing how it was more than just crime. It was political control. So with his administration, I'd put a 4 out of 5. Now let's talk money, because no one made more legally than Costello. He was the mastermind behind illegal gambling operations. He controlled bookmaking, slot machines, and horse racing in New York, Louisiana, and Florida. Costello's empire stretched from the streets to the casinos. He worked with Meyer Lansky to help fund new Las Vegas, and he ensured that the Mafia had a permanent grip on gambling in America. And while other bosses relied on loan sharking and dope, Costello focused on high-end, low-risk money streams. And that's why he is one of the richest bosses of all time. So I'd have to give a 5 out of 5. And then his influence, this is where he really excelled, in my opinion. He didn't just influence criminals, he influenced governments. He had judges in his pocket, police on his payroll, politicians following his orders, and the connections of Frank Costello stretched all the way to Washington, D.C. While other bosses were bribing cops, Costello was bribing senators, and that's why they called him the prime minister of the underworld. 5 out of 5. Discipline, unlike bosses like Vito Genovese, John Gotti, Costello, he drew a little bit of attention to himself, but it was just because of his stature. But he wasn't on wiretap. He he kept the family out of wars. He focused on profit over power. He made sure the Genovese family, which was called the Luciano family at the time, was stable and respected. And even when he was under investigation, he didn't act like a thug. He acted like a gentleman, a businessman. And I would say Genovese family was 5 out of 5 during his rule. And legacy, Costello's legacy, simple. He turned the Mafia into an empire. Without him, organized crime might have stayed in the streets, but thanks to Costello, it moved into skyscrapers, courtrooms, and boardrooms. And even after he's forced into retirement in 1957, his impact never faded. The Genovese family remained the most powerful family in America, all because of the foundations that he built. So his final score, 28 out of 30. This places him in the S tier right next to Lucky Luciano. Frank Costello might not have been the most feared, but he was one of the most powerful. And while other gangsters fought in the streets, he fought in the halls of power, and that's why, to me, he stands among the Mafia's greatest bosses. And now we go to Vito Genovese. I call him the power-hungry tyrant. Some Mafia bosses would rule with strategy, some ruled with influence, but then you had Vito Genovese, who ruled with pure fear. He wanted absolute power. He wanted the Mafia under his control, and he was willing to kill anybody who stood in his way. And we go into his leadership. You look at, I guess the one word that would represent him, one thing above all, is ruthless. You see, Luciano ran the Mafia like a CEO. Costello ran it like a politician, and Genovese, he ran it like a dictator. So if you crossed him, you didn't get a second chance. He believed in absolute loyalty or absolute death. He took over in 1957 after forcing Frank Costello into retirement with an assassination attempt. Costello got lucky and survived, but the message was clear: Genovese was taken over. So I would put his leadership at 4 out of 5. Like I said, some rule through love, others rule through fear. He definitely ruled through fear. And Genovese had a strong, disciplined crew, but his paranoia, in my opinion, hurt him. He surrounded himself with some of the toughest mobsters in history: Tony Bender, Mike Miranda, and Vincent the Chin Gigante. But the problem was he never fully trusted them. He's always looking over his shoulder, fearing betrayal, and in the Mafia is a little bit of a dangerous way to lead. And so I would put his administration at a 4 out of 5. Economics, I'll say this: if there's one thing Genovese did right, he did make money. Under his leadership, the Genovese family, started to dominate the drug trade along with the Bonanos. That's not necessarily a good thing, but it did bring money. While many of the other bosses avoided narcotics, Genovese embraced it because he saw it as the future. And he was right. The Mafia made millions, maybe even billions off of heroin, but, there was a problem. Economics, 5 out of 5. Influence. Genovese wanted absolute control of the Mafia. But then, besides him not trusting people, he had the problem that no one trusted him. You see, Luciano and Costello were respected. Genovese, he has fear, but never fully accepted. Even the Jewish Mafia with Lansky, Siegel, they kept him at a distance. The reason why is because they knew he was too unpredictable. He tried to take over the commission after eliminating Costello, but the other bosses weren't having it. Instead, they set him up. He ends up in prison for most of his reign as boss, and that was part of the problem. Genovese obviously wanted discipline, but he didn't know how to maintain it. Under Chin Gigante, who kept things quiet, I'd say Genovese was too aggressive, too reckless, and too paranoid, and that's what got him caught. He gets convicted and gets 15 years in prison. And, to me, that hurts his score. I give him a 3 out of 5. And then legacy, He did leave behind a powerful organization. His own downfall was inevitable. In 1959, the other mafia bosses, in my opinion, they set him up on the heroin trafficking charges. I think it was Costello's last laugh was to get Vito Genovese put away. So he gets 15 years in prison and died behind bars in 1969. The Genovese family survived without him, but his reign as boss, it was short-lived. So I give his legacy 4 out of 5. And so for a final score, I give him 24 points. That does keep him in the A tier. He was strong, he was feared, he was ruthless, but in the end, he just wasn't the boss the Genovese family needed. You see, power isn't everything, and for Genovese, it was his own ambitions that led to his downfall. Next, we go to Benny Squint, Philip Benny Squint Lombardo. I call him the ghost boss of the Genovese family. Most mafia bosses want power, money, and recognition, but Philip Benny Squint Lombardo, he wanted none of it. He wasn't just a boss, he was a ghost. Law enforcement never got a clear shot at him. The other crime families didn't even know he was in charge, and yet behind the scenes, he orchestrated everything. As we go into his leadership, he was unlike any boss before him. He ruled in the shadows, so instead of sitting at the head of the table, he put other men in the chair while he pulled the strings. The FBI thought that Funzi Thierry was a boss, and they even thought that Fat Tony Salerno was a boss, but neither of them were. They were just front bosses, puppets for the real boss, Lombardo. Even at commission meetings where the biggest decisions in the mafia were made, Lombardo sent his front boss instead. The other crime families weren't even aware he was the true head of the Genovese family, and that's how careful he was. So I'd put his leadership at a 4 out of 5. Running a mafia family is hard enough when you're controlling the shots publicly, but Lombardo did it while staying invisible, and that's next level administration. Even though his front bosses were the publicly inducting members into the mafia, every single button man had to be personally approved by Lombardo. He controlled the books, decided who got made, and ensured that only the most loyal soldiers were brought in. And this strategy kept the Genovese family strong, secretive, and nearly untouchable. So I'd give a 5 out of 5 for his administration. Money-making, economics. Lombardo's era was one of economic dominance for the Genovese family. While other families were still focusing on loan sharking and gambling, Lombardo ensured his Genovese had their hands deep in legitimate industries, and the family started to dominate construction, labor unions, real estate, and get involved in Wall Street scams. And by having a front boss like Fat Tony Salerno running street operations, Lombardo kept all the heat off himself. No wiretaps on his conversations. No snitches giving up his name. He was untouchable. 5 out of 5. Influence, despite staying in the shadows, Lombardo did have serious influence. He wasn't a flashy political operator like Frank Costello, but he had absolute control over the mafia's most powerful family. And during his reign, the Genovese were arguably the most powerful mafia family in the United States, even though the Gambinos had John Gotti rising through the ranks later on, and the Lucchese's had, people like Gaspipe Casso. No one could challenge the strength of the Genovese family. And I would give his influence personal, like 4 out of 5. Discipline, one of Lombardo's greatest strengths was his ability to maintain discipline and secrecy within the family. And you had other bosses that would bring unwanted attention, but Lombardo kept the Genovese family low profile, and that made it nearly impossible to infiltrate. And under Lombardo's leadership, there's no high-profile rats, no public betrayals, and no reckless shootings. He ran things like a ghost, but he was fully in control. And so I would give him 5 out of 5. And then legacy. His legacy is one of mystery, but of brilliance also. Because of his unique leadership style, we don't have many records or stories about him as we do about, Lucky Luciano, Costello, or Vito Genovese. But what we do know is that he ruled during one of the most critical times in Mafia history. Even after he stepped down in the early 80s, that system of front bosses continued, making the Genovese one of the hardest families to prosecute. And, that tradition, has continued even today, where there's still questions of who really the boss is. So have to give his legacy 4 out of 5. So final score for him is 27 out of 30. So that puts him in the A tier. The ghost boss is definitely wasn't a boss who sought fame or glory. He didn't need his name in the headlines. He didn't need the streets to fear him. He just needed control. And with him, he did something that most no other boss could do. He just disappeared. Most of the other bosses end up dead in prison or making headlines. He just kind of faded away. So now the odd father who outsmarted the FBI, that's Vincent Gigante. Some mob bosses ruled with money, some ruled with violence, and I would say Chin ruled with deception. So for 3 decades, the FBI tried to take him down, and he had a trick up his sleeve. He convinced the whole world that he was insane. And while law enforcement wasted years trying to prove he was faking everything, Gigante was secretly running the most powerful mob family in America. So with his leadership, he ruled with an iron fist. By the time he took over in 1981, the Genovese family was already the strongest in the country. And then during the reign of Gigante, it continued to be nearly untouchable. You had John Gotti making headlines and bosses like Tony Ducks Corallo and even Fat Tony going to prison. Gigante was able to avoid getting put in prison so he could keep his power, or he did until towards the end. And he was so careful he didn't really attend commission meetings. He usually would send top capos on his behalf. He did a lot to ensure that he avoided law enforcement. So his leadership, I have to give him a 5 out of 5. I thought that he was definitely respected as a leader, even though it was odd what he was doing, putting on the act. The administration, he perfected the structure that Lombardo had created, using front bosses and street bosses to throw off law enforcement. Even though everyone knew he was a real boss, no one could prove it, and on paper it looked like other men were in charge, while Gigante was just a crazy guy walking around in pajamas on the street. Even the FBI knew he was running the show, but without solid evidence, they couldn't touch him. And he had great people around him. I'd put a 5 out of 5. Economics, under Gigante, the Genovese family continued to have massive rackets across multiple industries. They were in the construction, later labor unions, loan sharking, gambling, extortion. They had the fish market. They had so many industries that was providing different levels of money. It wasn't just concentrated in one thing. You look at the Jacob K. Javits Center. That was a massive NYC construction project that the Mafia controlled behind the scenes, and it's mostly the Genovese. And so while other families would lose money from high-profile busts, Gigante made sure the Genovese family kept on expanding. And he didn't just focus on the streets. He had moved the family into more corporate crime. So economics, 5 out of 5. Influence. Gigante wasn't just powerful inside the Mafia. He was also powerful outside. He had control over major labor unions, which means he could influence multi-million-dollar construction projects. So that gave him real power over businesses, politicians, even some law enforcement. And so if you wanted to build something in New York in the 80s, you had to deal with the Genovese family. So I would say his influence, not as much as like a Costello or someone like that, but I'd still give him a 4 out of 5. Discipline, Gigante hated attention, and he expected the same from his men. Unlike a John Gotti, his contemporary, who craved the spotlight, Gigante demanded secrecy. You couldn't even mention his name as chin. You had to point to his chin. And the thing was, though, if you broke the rules, you were dead. He had no patience for loose cannons, and he thought you were a problem. He eliminated you before you really became one. So I give him a 5 out of 5. And so let's talk about the real reason that Gigante was able to rule for so long. It was, to me, his insanity act. He spent decades pretending to be mentally ill, wearing pajamas in public. He mumbled to himself. He was always checking himself into the psychiatric hospitals. The feds, they tried for decades to prove he was faking, but they never could convict him up until the end because they didn't have any proof. And then even during the trials, he would play the role perfectly, delaying, stalling, outlasting law enforcement at every turn. And then his legacy, it's undeniable. Because of his leadership, the Genovese family remained the most powerful and secretive. While the Gambinos fell apart after Gotti, the Genovese kept on thriving. But in the end, even he couldn't outrun justice forever. In 1997, after decades of avoiding conviction, he finally gets sentenced to 12 years in prison. He died behind bars in 2005, but his legacy lived on. So I'd give the legacy a 4 out of 5, and that gives him a final score of 28 out of 30. So this puts him in the S tier. He is one of the most brilliant bosses in Mafia history. He ruled with fear, strategy, and deception, and for over 20 years he stayed one step ahead of the FBI. And while other bosses let their egos get in the way, it seemed like Gigante was playing the long game. And in my opinion, he won. So now we go to the last boss, Barney Bellomo. He's considered some people say he's the current boss, but I'm going to talk about him. I mean, he got started in the mob as, I think he got made at 20 years old. He's one of the youngest made guys ever. He's one of the most I would say one of the most low profile and disciplined bosses in the Mafia. You had other bosses that end up in newspapers, courtrooms, or body bags, but it seems like Bellomo has kept the family powerful and under the radar for the most part. I mean, they've had, you do have some cases, but you haven't had the big ones that, take down the full family like what the Bonanos have went through or the Colombos in the past. And in today's world, you have to understand the Mafia doesn't run like it did in the old days. There's less street violence and more white-collar crime. And to me, Barney Bellomo has adapted perfectly to that, to the modern-day Mafia. So his leadership, unlike past bosses who rule with fear, I would say Barney rules with calm authority. He's respected, he's careful, and most importantly, he stays out of the spotlight. No flashy behavior, no unnecessary killings, just business. He took over in the 90s, but unlike other bosses who collapsed under pressure, he survived multiple indictments. He's still in power today, according to many. To me, that just talks highly of his leadership, so I have to put a 5 out of 5. Now about the Genovese administration, he's continued the Genovese tradition of ruling panels. When he was in jail, that was something that the Genovese have done to, at least during the days going all the way back to, Vito Genovese when he was in prison. And you see that power is spread out among trusted captains and, leaders within the Genovese. And, this actually makes it harder to take down because there's not really one single boss calling every shot. And the feds have always said that the Genovese are the most sophisticated crime family. And I would say that Bellomo's leadership, really speaks highly to that. And, I would put the administration 4 out of 5. Money, under Bellomo, they continue to be involved in different rackets. It's not like it used to be. It's definitely a lot different today, but they still do have some unions. I don't think the Genovese are getting sloppy with, doing street level dope stuff. I think they're focused more on the long-term money. And, I feel like that Bellomo is keeping the family at least surviving. And I would say economics, probably a 4 out of 5 for him. His influence, he is respected. Unlike the past bosses, he doesn't really seek unnecessary alliances. He's just really focused on keeping the family stable. And you have all these other families that have collapsed. The Colombos are a joke. The Bonanos got wrecked by informants, and even the Gambinos kind of lost their grip. But the Genovese, they've never really lost their power. So I'd put the influence at 4 out of 5. And then discipline, you don't see, there's not any public shooting. You don't see you don't see Bellomo on the street showing off. He's really more of an old school mafia type guy. He keeps quiet, he makes money, and he stays off the radar. I believe he keeps his capos in line. His businesses are profitable, and he doesn't really make a lot of enemies. And to me, that's Mafia 101. And so I'd put discipline. They're really disciplined. 5 out of 5. The legacy, well, it's still unfinished, I would say. That's the only one issue. That's the only issue. He's still supposedly in power. Unlike Lucky Luciano, Costello, or Chin, his legacy's not complete yet. Will he go down as one of the greatest, or will he end up getting taken out or taken down like the rest? Time will tell, but so far, he's done everything right. Again, I have to, put him, I put that his legacy probably a 3 out of 5 right now. I mean, it could definitely go higher. He's an A tier, 25 out of 30. Barney Bellomo, to me, is one of the smartest bosses of the modern era. He runs the Genovese family with structure, discipline, and power. And, he's maybe not finished yet, but, I can't put him in the S tier yet. So, but still, compared to every other boss in New York today, he's the last true Mafia Don. Okay, so now we will summarize and put into the tier list all of the 6 mob bosses of the Genovese family, going from the worst to the best. So based on this criteria, number 6, that would be Vito Genovese, 24 points. That's still the A tier. Next, we have Barney Bellomo. He has 25 points. All right, number 4, we've got Philip Lombardo. He's at 27 points. He's still in the A tier, just barely misses the S tier. Next, number 3, you have Vincent Gigante. He's at 28 points, and he's tied with also at 28 points on the S tier, Frank Costello. And the best boss of the Genovese family and its whole 100-year plus history is, no surprise, Lucky Luciano, a perfect score of 30 out of 30. I have to say that with the Genovese family, they've never really had a bad boss. They're all, as you could see, A tier and S tier. But now I turn it over to you. Who do you think was the greatest Genovese boss of all time? Did I get it right, or did I rank someone too high or too low? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let this debate get going. If you love real mob history, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because we've got more deep dives into the world of organized crime. So until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.